All right, well, thank you very much for coming, for saving the best for last, as conferences do. First, I want to take a moment before I launch into introducing the speakers to thank Dorothy for putting this together. No, and I will for a particular reason, which is that she insisted from the very beginning that we have an interdisciplinary conference. And I did a little count at the beginning of the afternoon session, and just over 10% of the participants were from natural science departments. And I think that's pretty impressive, and you deserve some kudos for that. Secondly, I want to thank the previous speakers, especially Yun Jung, for setting out a really, the beginnings of a historical perspective on this. And I think that we can see the BRI in a very different light when we think about it through the historical lens of China's history. And you'll hear some really interesting information and perspectives on that in the next talk. And also, I want to bring up an idea that hasn't really gotten a lot of attention yet today, which is that the BRI is occurring at a unique time in Earth's history as well, when our climate is changing faster than it has at any other time except for when meteors have hit Earth. And this is having a large impact on both the causes and drivers of the BRI and on its consequences. And these historical and environmental will each inform our views of causes and consequences. And we're lucky to have today Eric Tagliacozzo from Cornell and Howie Epstein from UVA to talk about them. Eric is a Chinese historian who works across very large spatial and temporal scales to try to understand China's international, transnational, and multinational relations. And I think you're going to enjoy what you hear from him. And Howie is a biogeochemist who's been doing research in China now for almost 2 decades, I believe. He's an expert also, as you'll see, in using satellite data to help address environmental questions. He's a former senior international scientist with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and is advising China now as it develops the digital Belt and Road. I'm really happy to welcome them both. And Eric, we'll start with you.
Okay, so I'm going to just join the long list of people who thanked Dorothy very much for inviting all of us, getting together this incredible crew. And I was really delighted to be asked to come. I also want to thank Clara and also the other graduate students who have been involved with this, because these kinds of things never get done without many hands pitching together and lots of emails going back and forth. So thanks very much to both of you for having me. I'm going to be talking a little bit, as Manuel said, about the kind of the very big picture about Belt and Road. So not what has been called Belt and Road for 3 or 4 or 5 years, but what this might have been for several hundred years, and in fact over 1,000 years, because we're going to try to introduce some big perspective with the last panel to kind of zoom out on some of these ideas. And I'm just going to start with this image because it's this kind of beautiful image of the kind of border regions of China to the west in Xinjiang, bordering on Central Asia, which has been talked a lot about, and which in fact is really the kind of impetus for a lot of the ideas of the Belt and Road idea, is kind of building on the Silk Route and what that has meant in history, both to China and to the West. But what I want to suggest in this talk, because the part of the world I really work on most is Southeast Asia, is that most of what we should really be thinking about with this is geared towards Southeast Asia, that history, the long history, the big picture of Belt and Road ideas. It's really much more about Southeast Asia numerically in terms of the numbers of Chinese that have ever left China than it is about Central Asia. So this image, while beautiful, while sexy, while romantic, makes us think of Marco Polo, makes us think of these exiled Qing officials who were sent out to Xinjiang, Ningxia, places like this, kind of on the outskirts of nowhere, the horse peoples of Central Eurasia. It's important, but it's more of a kind of a wispy idea than it is a reality of feet on beaten paths. So I'm going to be talking more about this big arena, Southeast Asia and China as part of a large maritime space. And what I'm going to try to do in the 25 minutes I have is to talk a bit about some of the early interactions between China and Southeast Asia. And then I'm going to just focus down, because we can only do so much. I've noticed that a lot of the presenters try to focus down their work to manageable bites of information, the way CK just did too. I'm going to focus down on one commodity chain that was moving from China down to Southeast Asia that built up this history of Belt and Road. And then I'm going to do the opposite and focus on one commodity chain that was moving in the other direction. So for the first one, I'm going to talk about ceramics coming south from China to Southeast Asia. And then for the second one, I'm going to talk about marine goods moving north as part of that Belt and Road back up to China. And I'm going to finally end by focusing on one place in Southeast Asia, Brunei, to think about what that's meant for the longue durée history of China and Southeast Asia Belt and Road over a long period of time. So let's start first with the kind of the long history just at a glance. If we're thinking about Chinese contact with Southeast Asia, we're thinking about really large amounts of people that actually move down to Southeast Asia. It starts with a trickle, it ends in a flood in the 19th century, and it's still going on today, of course. But we have records that go back all the way to Han times. 140 CE is one of the first dates that's traditionally given for kind of first notices of definitive toponyms in Southeast Asia. And as we move from the Han to the Six Dynasties and to the Tang period, we start to see mentions in Chinese sources of numerous different other people that are coming by sea as part of what we think of now as Belt and Road in its long history. So Persians, Arabs, other people. I've been to a mosque in Guangzhou where it's said that the Nabi Muhammad, the uncle of Muhammad, is buried in the mosque. I don't think anybody has ever been able to definitively prove that, but many people say it. And there are indeed mosques that are very, very old in places like Guangzhou and elsewhere. We also know that in this very early period, there were Chinese moving down to Southeast Asia, people like the monk Fa Xian, who goes to Buddhist Sumatra, and in fact, the rise of the first great maritime empire in Southeast Asia, the empire of Srivijaya, which exists from the 7th century to the 12th century. A lot of our best records about this huge maritime empire, which is centered around the Straits of Malacca here. This is where Srivijaya was centered. A lot of those best records are in Chinese. So it's clear that there is a kind of normal intercourse going between these two different places, that there are Chinese moving in large numbers to various places in Southeast Asia, and you can still see that there on the map. Now, obviously, most of these Chinese are coming from the places that are closest to Southeast Asia, and that's what I want to focus on in the next few minutes of the talk, is to talk about these southern provinces of southeastern China, particularly Guangdong and Fujian. These are the two places that are sending most of the people down to Southeast Asia. So when we think of the beginnings of Belt and Road in historical time, most of these people, they're not coming from Shandong, they're not coming from Hunan, they're not coming from Xinjiang, Ningxia, places like this. They're coming from the places that you would think they would be coming from to move down to Southeast Asia. And it's during the Song dynasty, between 960 and 1279, that we start to see certain patterns developing that become hallmarks of what we can think of the Belt and Road over long periods of time. One of the first of these is the sprouting of cities either at the coast or near the coast that are involved in these kind of trades to Southeast Asia. So Hangzhou, Mingzhou, Guangzhou, Quanzhou, all of these cities start to become important in kind of initiating a circular kind of conveyor belt of trade down to Southeast Asia. Second, we start to see also embassies that are going to the so-called Nanyang or South Seas. The Chinese start to send embassies south to kind of tabulate who is who, what is what in different places, and what is produced in different places as well. And we start to have a record of this too. Third, the Chinese court starts really pushing shipbuilding projects. That's very important in Guangdong and Fujian as technologies for piloting and depth sounding and direction finding all start to improve. Chinese shipping, and we saw that earlier image of the Zheng He expeditions in the early 15th century. This was a time when China was by far the most important maritime power in the world. There was nothing that the West could do on the high seas that could possibly match China in this regard. And fourth, and finally, during the Song, kiln building becomes very important too. And that's particularly important for this short presentation that I'm going to give, because it starts to put down the bones for an export industry that the Chinese are going to be able to actually continue with Southeast Asia by exporting ceramics, which I'll talk more about in a moment, to Southeast Asia for different kinds of products, which I'll also go into. So there's one particular scholar, kind of a doyen of this kind of history, a man named Wang Gengwu, who many of you will know, who has really talked about the rise of the Song as a time when this kind of leisure class in China was starting to rise to the top, at the same time that the court was not afraid about having these connections with places. And we see a steady stream of products starting to come to China from Southeast Asia that give rise to this entire idea of the beginnings of what we now call a Belt and Road, which of course at that time didn't have that name. So if we think about these products, I want to suggest one work which is really important, and it's a book called Chu Fan Zhi by a scholar named Chao Zhukua, who was writing in 1225. He was the portmaster of Chuanzhou on the coast, and he wrote this incredible book which talks about all the different products that are coming from the maritime countries to the south, which he subsumes under the name of the Nanyang. And that's what we start to really see during this time. Now, of course, one port becomes more important than others, and this is a European rendering of that port from a little bit later, but that's Canton or Guangzhou. The golden age of this kind of trade really passes through these southeastern ports to Southeast Asia, and these routes start to take off from the southern coastal cities of China. They're called the Jiaoguang routes. Some of the junks that were coming from Song Dynasty China to continue this trade with Southeast Asia were just enormous. I mean, we're talking about 600-ton junks with literally hundreds of people on board putting their commodities onto the ship, 100 feet long or more, 30 feet wide, with a great amount of ballast in the hull. These are really big ships. They're not small ships. There's a lot of cargo moving between these places, and that, of course, is important because anytime we think about the amounts of cargo that could move by land across Central Asia as part of this Belt and Road idea, compared to the amounts of cargo that could move by sea, it's infinitesimal, the amount that could move by land as opposed to what could move by sea. So that's important in thinking about scale. The Jiaoguang routes, some of them hug the coasts of Southeast Asia, but some actually go out to the island world itself, to places like the Philippines and Borneo, down to Indonesia. And in fact, at this time, the Chinese are producing charts that are actually very accurate renderings of what territory would have looked like as seen from the decks of ships. So the Wu Pei Zhi charts and other charts compare favorably to Portuguese and Spanish portolans and rudders and other kinds of knowledge of the sea. We have a lot of archaeological detritus that shows us the kind of depth of this trade that is actually getting more and more advanced over time. Cornell has a place in this history. I'm happy to tell you there's a book that was published some years ago about an archaeologist named Tom Harrison. The title of the book is not great for what it says about Harrison, someone I've never met. It's called The Most Offending Soul Alive. You hope to not have a book written about you called that. But apparently he was a very difficult person, but he really knew what he was doing with the archaeological records, and found lots and lots of Chinese material in Southeast Asia that allows us to see the kind of burgeoning of these trades over time. Now, of course, this is not just a Chinese picture. We don't think of Southeast Asia as an empty space, some kind of tabula rasa that is just enacted, that Chinese history has enacted upon it. Since I'm a Southeast Asian historian, I would never allow that kind of narrative to be propagated. But unfortunately, the records are so much more heavily weighted towards China than they are towards Southeast Asia that over time, that is something that has really come about, an impression that Southeast Asia needed Chinese contact much more than the opposite way around. I think that's not really true. I think what is true is that this was an interaction that took place on fairly equal terms over time, even though Southeast Asians wanted the imprimatur of the Chinese court. It was important in local politics to be able to say that the Chinese court recognized you as a Southeast Asian potentate or the suzerainty of your kingdom. And again, we know from Chinese records, for the most part, of numerous people that were going back and forth, embassies that were coming in different directions, and tombs, like a Chinese tomb in Brunei from 1264. The gravestone actually says, "Here lies Pu," which is apparently a transliteration of Abu, or son of in Arabic. It was a merchant from Quanzhou who had come down to Southeast Asia, and we know in the opposite direction these tombs exist too. In Nanjing, there's a diplomat from Brunei who is buried there, and apparently the reason he died in medieval times was because he just couldn't take the difference in temperatures between Southeast Asia and China during the winter. So I think about that when our president tells us that there's no such thing as climate change, that it's a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese to try to dampen American productivity, that there's no such thing as climate change. Actually, there really is a difference in climate between these places, and that would have been something that people would have had to contend with as they moved between the two places. So let's just focus down a little bit on the trades moving south and then the trades moving north. Ceramics are very important. They can give us an idea of what these harbors would have looked like. This is an early European drawing of what very early Singapore would have looked like in the 19th century, but it probably looks fairly similar to what a lot of these ports in early modern times would have looked like, where everything was built up along the actual harbor. There was lots of shipping, and then, as you can see on this side of the rendering, lots of local people who would have lived off of that kind of commerce. So ceramics help to tell us certain things about what was actually going on. And of course, when we think about these ceramics, we think about the great centers of ceramic production in China that allowed this Belt and Road to work towards maritime Southeast Asia. Places like Jingdezhen, which is shown here in this Chinese painting, where you can see ceramics are being produced in industrial quantities. These are not elite aesthetic pieces for the court that are kind of ethereal and thin and beautiful. They're sturdy. They're made to be on those huge ships that I was describing, and they are sent not in the thousands, not in the tens of thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands down to Southeast Asia. And you can buy them on eBay. Enough of them are dug up in wrecks and in tombs that you can actually go to eBay and buy some of these ceramics for prices that normal people can actually afford. What are they used for in Southeast Asia? Well, they're used by elites on dinner tables, but they're also used for a bewildering array of other uses. So one of the most important uses in Southeast Asia is that the big Chinese ceramics, which were produced with technologies which were far in advance of anything that Southeast Asians had at the time, were used as burial like coffins, basically. You would put someone into a large blue and white vase. You would drill a couple of holes in the bottom of it so that as the body decomposed, the effluvia of the body, we're made up of something like 80% water, right? The effluvia of the body would actually drain into the forest floor. And this is something that you find across medieval and early modern Southeast Asia, across many different countries, these jar burials in Chinese ceramics. You can see, again, how the Belt and Road actually affected people's everyday lives. We also have descriptions of what the Chinese and others thought Southeast Asians did with these ceramics, and I want to just read you a small piece from Cao Zhuqua's Chu Fan Zhi in 1225, where he talks about ceramics going to the Philippines. On each island lives a different tribe. Each tribe consists of about 1,000 families. As soon as a foreign ship comes in sight, the natives approach it to barter. They live in rush reed huts. In the most remote valleys, there lives another tribe called Haitan, or Negrito. They are of small stature, have brown eyes and frizzled hair, and their teeth shine between their lips. They live high up on the tops of trees, where they dwell in families of 3 to 5 individuals. Crawling through the thickets of the forest, they shoot from ambush at passerby, whereby they are most dreaded. But if a porcelain bowl is thrown up towards them, they rush onto it, shouting with joy, and escape with their spoils. So you can see this is almost like a kind of evolving, burgeoning anthropology among these Chinese writers about what they thought was going on with Southeast Asia and the exchange of goods. Some of it's right, some of it's wrong, So it's very fanciful in a lot of ways, but it shows a kind of an evolving cynic worldview about what's happening to Southeast Asia in the south. This trading world can actually be pieced together through this kinds of maritime archaeology between China and Southeast Asia. So when we do talk about Belt and Road, a lot of the material that's actually left to tell us about this, the stuff that survives in a monsoon climate, are things like ceramics. This is a kind of a useful map because it shows you where some of this stuff appears all over Southeast Asia in different places. And there's a lot more to talk about this, but I want to make sure I don't go over my time. So let me flip the directions now, and instead of talking about one class of commodities moving south that make up the Belt and Road, let me talk about a different class of commodities that are moving north in the opposite direction. So this is a book, well, this is just more traders in Southeast Asia, and you can see a mix of different people here with the hats of Europeans, but also Chinese with conical hats, and then various people, Southeast Asian peoples too. This is a rendering of that. Oops, okay. So let me just talk about this book, because this book is extremely important, and I think some of you in this room will know it, but it's an older book now. But this is the book that made me want to become a scholar. So I remember being a high school student in New York City and finding this book in the Columbia University East Asian Studies Library and reading this book and deciding, okay, now I know what I'm going to do with my life. This is The Vermilion Bird by Edward Schaefer. He was a geographer at Berkeley. And it's all about, as you can see from the subtitle, it's Tang Images of the South. He wrote a companion book called The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, which is about the same thing in Central Asia. And this book really shows you what the Chinese thought about Southeast Asia in Tang times. They saw it as a place of miasmic mists and screaming monkeys. The Nanyang was a place that was vaguely unhealthy. Nobody quite knew what was beyond those mists. And this was really an image that was propagated in China about what Southeast Asia looked like. So you could trade with these people, but you didn't necessarily want to be there. And the things that were coming back from Southeast Asia to pay for all of those ceramics and these various kinds of high-fired mechanical things that were coming from China down to Southeast Asia were of the opposite ilk. That is to say, almost all of it was biota. Natural products that Chinese wanted from Southeast Asia and that they deemed important and expensive and valuable enough to actually trade these things for. So things like turtle shell. And we know exactly which kinds of turtles: leatherback turtles, green turtles, hawksbill turtles, and I have the various Linnaean genus and species of all of these. If you're interested, we can talk about it. But all kinds of other products like this, not just turtle shell, but mother of pearl, rattan, and even evaporated sea salt. These were all things that the Chinese wanted. But it was also things like pearls. Pearls were very important. From the mollusk Melegrina margarifa, the placuna of the pearl was pounded into powder for use in the Chinese pharmacopoeia for all kinds of sicknesses. But the pearls themselves were also sewn into jewelry for wedding dresses, into hats for particularly important occasions, and things like this. But perhaps the most important, and for our purposes, the most interesting commodity that was coming from Southeast Asia at the beginnings of this Belt and Road were edible sea cucumbers, or what's called in Malay trepang. Now, a lot of you have probably eaten this. If this was an audience of people that had nothing to do with Asian studies, a lot of people would be looking like, what the hell is that? Most of the people in here know what this is, of course. You've eaten this in soup, probably not in Charlottesville, Virginia, or in Ithaca, New York, but you will eat it in Hong Kong, you'll eat it in New York, in LA, in any other place that has a high enough density of high-quality Chinese restaurants that you can get it. And of course, it's not a sea cucumber. It's not a vegetable, it's an animal. And one of the great experiences of my life as a Southeast Asianist has been snorkeling around parts of Southeast Asia and going to the places off the coasts of Borneo, Sulawesi, and other places, and seeing these things just living in their habitat. They are packed in quantities, white, gray, brown, black, of different sizes, and brought back to China as part of this trade over the centuries. And we have pretty good records about them. And we also know from these incredible animals that the Chinese were not just going to Southeast Asia, but they went to Australia. They went to the northern coast of Australia, where there are indigenous cave paintings by indigenous Australians showing ships that were coming looking for these things on the coasts near places like Cairns and Darwin. For a long time, all we had were the paintings, these indigenous Australian paintings about these ships, but eventually scientists started to get into the act too and actually look at the DNA of northern peoples of Australia and figure out that there were Chinese mitochondrial DNA in some of these people as well. That's the signal we agreed upon that I'm getting to the end. So let me just get to the last part of the talk and talk about what happens when this commerce starts to change. Now, once we get past the 16th and 17th centuries, we start to look at a different class of commodities that start to be the engines of world trade here. And that would, of course, be things like tea and, more controversially, opium. These are opium factories in Bihar and Bengal in eastern India, and that starts to make up much more of the trade once we get into the period as we move into the 17th and the 18th, particularly into the 19th century, that starts to drive the engine of thinking about Belt and Road. And that's a very different history, of course, than the kinds of things we've been describing before. Because those other things that we've been describing before were traded on more or less equal terms between China and Southeast Asia when we think about this Belt and Road concept. By the time we're getting to the 18th and certainly to the 19th century, tea, opium, silver are opening the Chinese economy, but are opening it in a way that is opening it by force rather than through mutual exchange of goods that are wanted on both sides. So that's a very different principle in thinking, especially about the things we were talking about in a contemporary way about Belt and Road. And I'm going to just end by thinking about a couple of the landscapes where this happens, and this is very important. This is the northern part of Borneo and the southern parts of the Philippines. We start to see the slaving of sea peoples in Southeast Asia on a huge scale, up to about 100,000 people brought into labor by indigenous sultanates like the Sulu Sultanate in order to ship these commodities up to the coasts of South China. And all of it coming in ships like this that are sailing along the coasts and pathways, the Jiaoguang routes and others from Southeast Asia up to China. Just the last word I'm going to say is if you're interested in this history, and as I've said, I think the actual demographics of this and the numbers of this are much, much higher for thinking about Belt and Road looking south than it is about the traditional way of looking west from China. I would suggest these two books, Anthony Reid's Southeast Asia and the Age of Commerce, which is actually two books, was published quite a while ago, but kind of totally redid the history of early modern Southeast Asia. And finally, Victor Lieberman's books, Strange Parallels, also two volumes written very much in reply to Anthony Reid's books about thinking about Southeast Asia in global terms and what that can tell us about the idea of Belt and Road, not just for China, but for all the other peoples of Asia that were part of that history too. Thank you for listening.